guys, it's me Sanchi after a really long time. I say it even though it's not a long time. And today I'm here with Ashvni, and for the first time in our life, we've been graced by drum roll Miss Natania Barron, who is an author of this incredible book called Queen of None, along with a lot of other books. She's actually a speculative writer and has appeared in a number of anthologies. Her first novel, The Pilgrim of the Sky, debuted in 2011. She's done her bachelor's from Loyola University, Maryland, and master's in English from the University of North Carolina. So, yeah, hi, Natania.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. How we met is actually, well, how I encountered you is actually pretty funny. I remember you made this Twitter post on something called Chins, and my friend actually sent it to me, and that's how I came across your profile, and I thought it was very interesting. So here we are. Thank you so much for coming.
No problem. Yeah, you never know what direction you'll meet somebody, and it's kind of one of the beautiful things about social media, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. And I'm so glad this happened because I genuinely really enjoyed reading your book, Queen of None. It was, what can I say, a ray of sunshine in my dark, dreary world.
Aww.
So, Natania, before we get into any details regarding, you being an author, would you like to give us a small introduction to your book, Queen of None?
Sure, absolutely. I like to say that the Queen of None was the thesis that I never got to write in graduate school because I really fell in love with the Arthurian myths when I was an undergraduate. But in graduate school, for many reasons, I ended up writing a thesis that was very much not the story that I wanted. And I had done a whole bunch of research in other directions. And a lot of that had to do with, a really close reading of the Arthurian tales as far back as I could go. And, we don't know exactly when they started. We think the actual Arthur could have been around 7th to 9th century. There's all kinds of interesting theories about that. But really the inspiration behind the story was I was reading Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. And, they kind of go through the regular, Uther Pendragon and Igraine kind of have this sort of face-swapping situation where she thinks she's, sitting down with her husband and it's not, and it ends up being somebody else, and they conceive a child and it's Arthur, and, Merlin, very famous story, kind of helps everything happen. But in the story, it says he also has a sister from the same two parents named Anna. And now Arthur has all kinds of very famous sisters. People have written many books about them, but this sister disappeared. For all that I could tell, she was absorbed into the myths of everybody else. And I thought, how strange that someone from the same, same marriage of these two people would just disappear completely. And that's really where I started asking the questions. I actually tweeted today that so many of my stories come from this idea of why not? Why not? And what happened to her? What if she didn't disappear? What if there's a better story for it? And I liked this idea of basically creating her own prophecy, because prophecies are so important in Arthur, but that she would be forgotten. So I could pretty much do whatever I wanted and have her live this existence outside of the regular narrative and blend in so much of my own learning. And that's really where the inspiration came from. It was a way for me to try to put my own fingerprint on a very overwhelming, very amazing genre within fantasy literature that I've always loved, but really take it from a very feminist point of view, someone who is stuck. There's no way she's going to ever escape the politics and the machinations of court. She's Arthur's sister, so she is prized chattel at best, right? She's literally going to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. But I also wanted to show a kind of agency that she could have within that, so that there's still a story to be had that has action and adventure, but it's not the same kind of action adventure that you hear, with the Knights of the Round Table and the Holy Grail. So that's how it came to be. And I wrote the draft of it about 10 years ago. I sat on it for years. Every year I'd come back to it and write some more in it and edit it and change some things around. And then I had someone approach me and say, hey, do you have any books lying around? And I said, well, I have this Arthurian tale that, got rejected once, and then I got embarrassed and just threw it at the bottom of my computer. And I love this story and I believe in it, and it just needs the right editor and the right publishing house. And that's how it came to be. And they loved it, and we worked on it, and now it's here.
And here we are.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting way you put the thing that, why not? Like you said in your tweet. And that comes to my next question, which is basically what's your favorite genre of writing?
I love fantasy. I just do. I love fantasy that is unpredictable. I read a lot of YA fantasy because I feel like YA fantasy actually has a lot more diversity and feminism and just thoughts about people of different backgrounds and sexualities and genders. It's starting to reach mainstream fantasy, but I'm not big. I mean, Tolkien was the first thing I read that just made me want to write. I just love this idea of creating a world that's similar to ours, but has, so many underlying incredible stories. So I read The Lord of the Rings probably 3 times over. I loved the Chronicles of Narnia, but there were always things about those stories. A, I felt left out as a woman. B, I felt that it was like the whitest thing ever in the universe. And how do you travel all these places? And either races are weird mirrors of exactly how they are in our world, with the same prejudices and discomfort, or they just don't exist, right? Like everyone has blonde hair and blue eyes, and everyone has the same kind of almost quasi-religions. And so I'm lucky that, I've been writing fantasy most of my life, but I feel like we're in a really strong age where we're seeing more and more writers really coming to publication with really fantastic stories that shake things up. N.K. Jemisin is one of my absolute favorite authors, and her Broken Earth trilogy I shove it at everybody I know, because that's the kind of stories that I hope to write someday. That, obviously I cannot as a white woman have obviously that same kind of thing, but this idea of truly making you think about things. The example I use is that, even though I read a lot of literature by people of color, I never considered hair texture. And if you read the Broken Earth trilogy, it's a big deal. It's a big deal because in Black culture, hair texture is a big deal. And I just have wavy hair. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but it is such a thing. And with world building, these other perspectives are so important. So I tend to gravitate toward that a lot, and just really trying to open up my own mind. Also, things like ability and disability are very important to me as well. A wonderful series that's YA is by Fran Wilde, the Updraft series. And you don't quite realize that it's about disability right away, but then you realize that it is as you go through it. And I won't spoil why that is, but if you want to explore something that really talks about that, I think that's an incredible thing, as well as people that are neurodivergent, and building characters that aren't all without crippling anxiety or depression and things like that, making sure that characters represent actual human beings. And fantasy can be such a wonderful place to explore that, because there are monsters and there is magic, and then trying to figure out where those things overlap and how that impacts humanity is really fascinating to me.
We have some really similar tastes when it comes to reading.
Good.
Just the same kind of authors, and that's what I want to talk about next, basically, and that's world building. So how do you do your world building? Because there's so much in world building, right? You have to look at everything. You have to look at geography, culture, trade, economics. So where do you pick up your elements from?
Well, I think that's, it really depends. I do write a lot of historical fiction, and historical fiction, it's got its benefits and its drawbacks for sure. But I think the interesting thing is about how I learned about you all is that I firmly believe that fabric is one of the best ways to do world building. Fabric is going to tell you almost everything you need to know about a culture, from their agriculture, their trade, their status, their races, because you're going to have to ask, who who picks the cotton, right? Or who's harvesting the flax, who's gathering the silkworms, who grows them, who benefits from them, who's selling it, how far does it have to go? All of these questions. What is the climate like that you're growing it in? So all of these questions are a really fun way to build your world. And our world has such an incredible history with fashion and with materials. I don't have to tell you, if you're familiar at all with with Asia and India, and how obviously how huge of an impact it had, how colonialism impacted it, how, you know, there was just atrocities done, but there were also incredible things that were done from an artist perspective. I mean, you know, I sometimes assume that people just know this stuff, but clearly I've had more response over I call them my thread talks, than just about anything I've done, because this is something so common to us. The last 100 years have dulled us to the concept of how important clothing is. And, you know, you didn't own 70 shirts 100 years ago, even with the beginnings of mass production. And you often remade a dress over and over again. But if you were really rich, you could wear a different dress for every event that you had. And the scaling, how much money that cost, there almost isn't a comparison, because it was so expensive before to own and produce clothing that $500 then is so much more now. It still sounds kind of like a lot of money, like a $500 dress, but a Regency gown for that much, we're talking about, it could be close to $30,000 for a wedding gown now, which occasionally you hear people doing that, but that's usually but that's just a regular, you know, it's a very nice gown. So I love that aspect of world building. I love food. World building through food is very similar in terms of access and agriculture. You know, you really kind of have to think in a lot of ways about how a culture builds. We know that, you know, pastoral cultures have very different tendencies in terms of how women are treated or how religion grows, versus migratory societies have very different understandings and how that relationship is to the earth and to animals. And so I like to kind of start with what I know of the world and then start asking those questions, the what ifs, the why nots, and build on that. You know, what would it look like if there was real magic that we could see and feel, so people didn't have to go hungry? You know, what if you lived in a world where women just could decide they didn't want to get pregnant, like some animals are able to do, right? It wasn't a concern, or that there was a magic drink you could take or a ritual that you could do. And that starts to spin off all these things. Now, that all comes with a caveat, especially in historical fiction, because I'm a major nerd. I'm probably the number one visitor to the Metropolitan Museum of Art website because I love it so much. But I have to be careful not to get what I call lost in the China patterns, because I love accurate historical detail. But if I've been spending 3 hours trying to decide what pattern should go on the teacups in this scene, I'm probably not really paying attention to the characters, because as much world building as you can do, you don't want to lose that really important part, which is the emotional connection that your readers have. Because no matter how, you know, exotic or strange the world, we're still reading those stories in this world that we're in right now. You know, this is still we're going to bring our own backgrounds and our prejudices and our thoughts and our emotions to it. So you just have to make sure that you're not navel gazing too much. But I try to give myself some freedom, especially right now in this time of the world, because I find so much comfort in research. I will always be a researcher, and yeah, keeping a lot of links open is really good. And Wikipedia is fantastic, especially if you start there. Many people don't realize how valuable the bibliography is at the bottom of Wikipedia articles. And it's the same thing with many other things. That's a great, you know, springboard. So
again, another point of similarity, like when you started talking about clothes, right, and making clothes, for the past since 2018, I guess, I started to learn how to knit. So I have been making my own clothes. In fact, wait, I'll show you this dress I made for a friend.
I'm excited. I can't sew. I knit and I crochet, but I'm miserable. Oh wow, that is beautiful.
So, like, you know, I put like the bag.
Oh, like, wow.
It's a knit dress, but
That's incredible.
I basically crocheted the button bands, and
Mhm.
because I couldn't find out an easier way to, make all to knit the button bands,
Yes.
so I just basically crocheted it.
Yeah, you can combine that. When I discovered crochet, it took me a long time because I started knitting and my brain was so stuck on knitting that it was so hard for me to change over to crochet. But then I realized that crochet is almost more like clay in some ways. You have this basic things you can do and you can shape it whatever way you want. That was so freeing for me. I actually have some alpaca wool from a friend of mine's alpacas that I've watched grow up on Facebook, and they sent them to me, and I cannot wait to make something out of it. So I feel you.
Wow. One of the ways I got over the whole crochet not being natural to my hands was that I knit with my right hand, and I'm a lever knitter. So, I just like jam one needle under my
Yes.
hand, and I crochet with my left.
Oh, wow.
That actually helps because, as a knitter, when you're knitting with your right hand, you're moving your left hand and your yarn is in the right thing. So when you crochet with your left, it's the same arrangement. So you're used to having the yarn in one hand and the instrument in one. So that helps.
For me, I basically realized that the thread was like another needle. And when I made that connection with the crochet, is you have the work and you have the crochet, and it's very similar. But yes, I'm with you. It's amazing. I've never made a full dress. That is incredibly impressive. So,
yeah, indeed. And Natania, coming back to your point, you said that your background is something that shows in your work. Yeah. So I know you have ADHD, and I also read that your mother and sister suffered from cancer. How do you think this affected your writing?
Well, I think those things, certainly for me, I started writing quite young, and I read voraciously. My most prized possession was my own little library stack of books. That was just the best, And so, it was very natural to me to kind of move into writing. My dad actually is also ill, and he's had a series of rare diseases since I was about 6 years old. So I grew up in a kind of unusual family dynamic where my father really couldn't be the sort of macho baseball playing dad as much, because he would get very, very sick. He was bedridden for quite a few years. He's doing great. He's still around. But I think I learned to, my hyper focus is writing. It's one of them for sure. And I have many interests, very many interests. But for me, the sort of meditative ability to kind of go into my stories is really how I process emotions. And my dog is saying hi. I was like, what is this?
Hello.
This is a dog. She's very cute. But I learned that, art in general became kind of my palette for emotions. I'm not a naturally expressive person necessarily. When I'm feeling a way, I don't tell people around me. I tend to keep it very much in. So art has always been the healthy way for me to get that out, because I didn't want to rock the boat when I was a kid. I didn't want to burden my parents with more than they dealt with. And my mom's cancer, when my freshman year of college, I had to change my college initially. I did 1 year at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst because she was so sick, and I stayed home with her. I actually had gotten into Ivy League schools and had decided last minute that I was going to stay home and help her. And I don't really remember much of that year, but I did a lot of writing, and really I started writing more seriously as a speculative fiction writer, because I had quite a few years where I was like, I don't want to say that I write fantasy, it's so dorky. And then I just said, I don't care. I am a dork. I'm a complete geek, and I love this stuff, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I also had my son. I have 2 kids. My son who is autistic. So that I didn't know, obviously, initially, but I started writing and really taking myself seriously and kind of committing to writing when I had him, because I had this moment that just said, I don't want him to say, Mommy, what did you want to be when you grew up? And I would say, I want to be a writer, but I don't have anything to show, right? There's nothing I could say. So that really was my impetus. And we've spent the last 15 years working so hard with him that I didn't quite put it together that it was very likely that I had ADHD. it really took until, and I'm almost 40, so it took until about 6 months ago where I really, for me, the strain of quarantine and losing, with ADHD, you love novelty, you love impulse, you love things to look forward to, changes in your day. This is all very exciting for me. And I work a job where I get to travel. I would travel the world. So I used before this year, I was probably in Europe 5 or 6 times a year. It was always something to look forward to. And all of a sudden that stopped and I was just stuck at home and I was getting so overwhelmed, so exhausted at the end of the day. I didn't have time to write. I didn't have time for anything. And I got on TikTok because my daughter, who's 8, was like, I wanted to make sure I knew what she was talking about. And I love social media. I've absolutely love social media. It can be terrible, but it's been the single best part for my career ever. And I started getting all these videos from people talking about women with ADHD. And it was bizarre. This algorithm seemed to quasi-diagnose me and at least give me some new language and things that I had struggled with my whole life that I thought was just my own shortcomings. So what has been really freeing for me is I had to go through those whole, here in the United States, it's difficult on a normal day to get good psychiatric care. Thankfully, I was able to do it, work with my doctor, get on better medicine. I've been trying different medications for anxiety and panic and depression for years. Well, there's a big reason that didn't work because I was treating a symptom and not the cause. So it's been incredibly eye-opening. And like I said, the relief has been great and it's been wonderful for my writing and for my art. I really had some difficult times. It's difficult to realize that you are fundamentally different. It's one thing to feel that way, but then when you realize like, oh no, this stuff is this doesn't go away. I get to treat it and learn my way around it. But once I let go of that, I kind of said, back to what I was saying about my emotions, art is my emotional language and I want to share it. And so I have anyway, but it's kind of given me a little bit more impetus to keep going. And I think it's important to hear, people that are neurodiverse writing neurodiverse stories, to have characters. I think certainly there are some in Queen of Nun. I don't think I think a lot of them could be diagnosed with a lot of really interesting things, and some of them have probably a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. But the book I'm writing right now, I actually have 2 main characters, and one is autistic and one has ADHD. And that's been really fun to kind of go in knowing ahead and knowing like, I know enough people and I have enough of this that I can do this in a way that people will probably not know unless they actually know enough people. Because as they say, one person with autism means one person with autism. It's not a spectrum. It is it's 4 dimensions of how people are. And that's an important thing for me to be able to do, especially from an own voices perspective now that I am officially there.
Yeah. And of course, that is amazing. I would love to read your new book when it comes out.
Sure.
I noticed you spoke about how fabric is, so fundamental to world building. And I did notice that in the story, Anna, the protagonist, she touches a lot of fabric. There's a lot of smells. There's a lot of picturesque nature. It was quite nice. I could smell the blossoms of the apple tree and, look at when she goes into the forest with Lancelot. It was amazing. We had a few more questions about your book, Queen of Nun, but of course, this is the non-spoiler section, which people can hear about. So, personally, I really enjoyed the book a lot. Like I told you, I stayed up a lot of nights. I am a student and I work on the laptop the entire day, so my eyes really pain at the end of the day. But it was so interesting that I just had to stay up at night and look into my mobile screen till I finished it. And there were some real moments that were very relatable to me. Even though this is set in, the Arthurian age, it was pretty interesting to me. For example, when Nimue, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, when Nimue said that, when she was born, she just wanted to eat a lot of food. She was really hungry. I can relate to that all the time.
Yeah, and that's not the only relatable part, right? Like, I think what you said in the beginning when you were talking about the book, about having a certain feminist perspective here, and I think we both really related to it. I couldn't read the book in its entirety for a very simple reason, that I would read a line and then that line would just hit me deep in my soul, and I would have to just like put the book down and be like, some things never change, or do they?
Well, that's
Most
always beautiful to
definitely.
hear because you want it to be right, and it's kind of poetic. There's a long poetic history for Arthur, so I want the language to be lush. And that's something people always say when I get reviews, lush writing, and I guess it is. I want it to evoke feeling, and that English, as ridiculous as it is of a language, because it really is, it still gives so much amazing flexibility. So many words, they can all mean the same thing, but they sound different. They look different on a page. I have a lot of opinions about, fonts and typeface and the way things look together. And I wanted to make that a big thing. And the environments are important because I wanted this to be sort of not really historic. If you read the opening, I talk about how it's kind of out of history. It's like a reflection of it, because there was no Arthur. And everything we know came, if you want to be historic, you're going to miss out on all these other characters. So I said, if I just say, this is the myth, but kind of through a mirror of time, then I could kind of go with it. And I love the pre-Raphaelite artists and their vision of the Arthurian world. And the women are always so statuesque, they're not wimps. They're strong, physically strong, beautiful women. They're muscular, they're round, they're curvy, and they're draped in these incredible dresses. And they're always in the middle of doing something amazing. And those were really a huge inspiration for me. It's like, what is going on in this picture? And how can I try to capture those moments where all the details are there? And it takes, you also know that the reader is going to bring in their own experiences and things as well. And I think for women, we are so often not in the stories, or if we are, we're just like plot points, and I wanted to make that more than plot points, for sure.
Most definitely, yeah. In fact, the specific point of portrayal of women, I really enjoyed the different body types women had in this story, and I recall telling Sanchi that, oh, look, there are so many different characters, and at some point I was rather um,
Flummoxed.
yeah.
Flummoxed by this portrayal
Thank
of,
you.
when a woman is round, like the kind of times we live in, if you have, okay, you're round, it's a bad thing for us, right? Like, how many times have people just told us, like, lose weight? But in the book, when you are talking about, say, a certain, this is the non-spoiler section.
Yes,
let's not too many spoilers.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, a good example is Guinevere. I wanted Guinevere to be very, very round and earthy. I mean, she is a heavy, voluptuous woman, and she gets pregnant and she gets even more voluptuous. And she is the most beautiful woman Arthur saw her and didn't even really dig chicks, but saw her and was like, she's so beautiful, I have to have her. And I don't think that it's funny because I do it unconsciously now, just because I know a lot of women, and I know women come in all shapes and sizes, and beauty is so much more interesting when it's inclusive, and we have different abilities as on top of that as well. And that's another thing that TikTok is fantastic about, that I've never seen women taking so much control of what is beautiful and it's an amazingly brave thing as well, of putting your body out there, flaws and all, and saying, calling out women who are, normal, not normal, but straight sized women, saying, oh, I have a little tiny belly, and going, no, this is a belly. This is beautiful, and this is fine, and this is how women's bodies are. I've had 2 kids. My body will never go back to whatever it was before. It doesn't mean that it's wrong or flawed. And that was the other thing with Anna. She has stretch marks at one point, if you remember. It's like very cliche,
yeah, That's the line that comes out to me, when she's telling Gwen, when she says that what does a quote unquote, what does a comely man like, what will a comely man like him see, what this body that has borne 3 children and has scars to show for it. Mm-hmm. That's one of the times I had to put the book down.
But it's something women since the beginning of time, our bodies change so much, our minds change. I joke when I was pregnant with both of my children, I think I wrote this a little bit into the story, is that I felt like a different person. I was not myself. I didn't write. I didn't play music. I didn't paint. I loved to watch weird TV shows. I was really into bizarre foods when I was pregnant with my daughter, which is like, Andrew Zimmern traveling the world, eating the most bizarre, gross things you could ever imagine in every culture in the universe. I don't find it gross. I find it fascinating. I'm sitting there just like, how many bugs is he eating? Straight from the cow, blood straight from the cow. Sure. It was just, I love learning about what that stuff is like. And I think when I was pregnant, it was just, I don't know. I found it. And I watched a ton of the Vampire Diaries. I watched the entirety of that entire series. I don't know. I can't explain it.
It's all right. We don't judge here. Your secret is safe with us and with whoever is listening to this YouTube stream. No, but yeah, I definitely found it very relatable. And especially, how people have this idea that, women should have round breasts, big breasts, and a big butt, but they should be stick thin. That is completely unrealistic,
Yeah. And there are some lucky women who have that particular ideal, but as someone who grew up in the 90s with heroin chic, I was like, there's no amount of dieting that will ever make me 97 pounds. Like I would be dead. But that was and it's interesting because in the Middle Ages as well, it was young bodies, especially almost, barely pubescent bodies were considered beautiful. But then there was a time where Rubenesque women, right, in the Baroque period with cellulite everywhere was considered, they called it butterfat was the description. Rolls were beautiful. And that's the thing. Beauty is not a singular experience, and there's so many cultural things that pay into that. We just, unfortunately, with mass media and with the beauty industry, it's so much easier to sell things if we tell people that that's the case. For me, someone commented on this I think 2 days ago about my eyebrows, and I always laugh because I grew up in the 90s. Eyebrows were not in. Like, eyebrows were, you had pencil thin eyebrow. I waxed the heck out of my forehead. I'm just glad they grew back. And people are always like, what did you do to your eyebrows? It's like, nothing. It's just like, and now it's big deal. And brow bars are all the rage. People penciling in and microblading and everything. And I'm just like, well, when I was in high school, people that said I had caterpillar eyebrows, and why don't you pluck your eyebrows more? And, beauty is fickle. That's why it's more about, you want it to be more about the people. And then if you represent a wide variety of people, you're not defining it as one thing. So.
Indeed, yeah. Beauty, I guess, does lie in the eyes of the beholder. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that was amazing. I really enjoyed, reading About Pfeiffer and how she was beautiful. And then there was Gwen, and there was Mavra, who had a different, completely different, although they were sisters,
Yeah, and that's actually, so the oldest stories, the Welsh triads, which are potentially even more ancient than when we first have them in the 10th century, they say that Arthur has 3 wives named Guinevere. The 3 wives of, I remember reading that and being like, everything's 3, right? 3 wives of Guinevere. They also say his 3 favorite mistresses, so clearly he had a lot going on. But I thought it would be neat to play on that and have the 3 sisters of Leodograns. All their names are from the same name. So Guinevere, Maura, and Huifar are all different Welsh derivatives. So that's kind of how I played that one out a little bit.
That was really interesting now that I see that,
Yeah.
So, yeah, Ashwini, I was saying that, things that leapt out to me didn't leap out to you, and vice versa. Like, you noticed the language thing while I did not. I was just very much, in the flow of things. So,
yeah.
we noticed different things.
I noticed how you were using, you had specifically mentioned it, in fact, that you were going to use a mix of archaic and modern language. And I did notice it. I was wondering why, though.
Well, you want to have the feeling of the place, right? So certain words, I think, help to build the world, right? So instead of ghost, we might say ghast, which is an older version of the word. And that makes it feel like fantasy without going the direction of like full Tolkien, where everyone speaks like they're in Shakespeare and it's very, very rigid and you don't quite have the emotional resonance. So I also, did fewer contraction words that might not have been as common, and tried to use the sort of that world as descriptors, because you certainly don't want to say like he was as loud as a train, because there's no trains. And even though Tolkien did that very famously in Lord of the Rings, that just even he was like trying to speak to his audience. But I think I found a pretty good mix, and I can write more heightened, and I'm certainly doing that right now. I'm writing a Regency story, so people do speak, but they're very witty in it, and you can't overdo it, because then it feels, a lot of people will immediately be turned off from it and you won't get the readers. So
yeah, understandable. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. So I would like to move on to the third section of this
sure.
interview.
Not yet. I have one left. One
left. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, I think the really interesting thing that I found in the book was, for the people who don't know, Ashvini and I are Indians, and Indians have a very specific culture towards a family. And although now most of us live in nuclear families, our families included, but there was this time where all of us were, in joint families, and we have this tight-knit community thing going on. So it was very interesting for me to see that, this lady, Anna, she has 4 children. I mean 5, but you get it, right? But like for first son, she sends him to court, to her brother's place. She sends her other 2 children to their uncle, and when she gives birth to her 4th and 5th child, RIP her daughter, but she sends her son to her older sister, who was childless. So very interesting for us to see this mother living without her children, something that we cannot fathom, right? Really not very natural to us.
And that's an old Celtic tradition. So it was actually in some things that I've read have been said that even the father's a man's relationship to his nephew is almost stronger than to their own son. That connection in Celtic lore and Celtic culture way back when was very, very strong. And this idea of foster children helped to build the families together. So ideally, if Arthur had children earlier, he could have even sent some of his children to be fostered by one of his sister or her sister's family. And that's why in the oldest stories, Gawain is Arthur's most prized knight. Like, bar none, he can do anything. He's the rock star. And then slowly other people come in, and in different tales he kind of changes, his whole personality changes. By the time you get to Mallory, he's an absolute jerk. He's awful. He sides with the wrong people. He's conniving. But over time that changed. So I wanted to blend those a little bit. But it is interesting. And it's not uncommon for that to happen. But they still have big family complexes, right? Like when Anna's done with her time in Orkney, she's got to come home, and they try to keep everybody as close as possible. But yeah, the nephew uncle relationship is historically very, very strong, and I wanted to maintain that in the story. And it's different for boys, always is. Women in especially in Western culture, in higher ranking families, were seen as very disposable. They had the dowry. They were going to be married off for an alliance. It's essentially arranged marriages, right? It's not a concept that's just known in some areas, and would be, and in some places it was almost like this is a loner child, so we're not going to spend the time to get to know them and to invest in their education. This person is really a pawn, and that's kind of where you get most of the women in the story had no say at any point. With the exception of Morgane and Morgause, and even to an extent on them as well, that they are they're only able to get away with it because they're Arthur's half sisters.
So you're telling me that the Celtic tradition, they were avuncular in nature? Interesting.
Well, kind of. I mean, it was just considered a very important connection, and very often nephews would be raised by their uncles. Yep.
Avuncular, yes.
Yeah.
And that's the
but
thing, right?
not always, but yeah. That's where the tradition came from with Gawain and Arthur.
Yeah, even Morgan and Margos, I mean, they had some privileges, but in the end, they were women. You know, they had to do things accordingly. Or even if you speak of Vivian, I think I'm giving too many spoilers now in the non-spoiler section. Okay, so
are we officially in the spoilers section? That's okay. We can make the.
Well, okay, I could give a disclaimer right now that I'm going to delve into a lot of spoilers. So in case you want to save yourself, maybe now is a good time to stop listening. Go ahead, read the book, and then come back and complete this video. We'll wait for you.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so going to the spoiler section, like I was saying, Vivian was a marvelous witch, but constrained only because, you know, Merlin didn't like her or didn't like her prophecies.
Right.
It's just sad. She was, of course, more powerful than him because, I mean, you know, it was obvious that one only somehow imprison somebody else when they are afraid of them being far more powerful, you know. So yeah, that was rather sad. But talking about Merlin, I found it interesting that throughout the book, it seemed to me that Merlin was the focus. He was the main villain, so to say. But then in the end, Anna realizes that she actually had a lot of grievances, maybe against her brother too, because he was the one really controlling her reigns, you know. I mean, he was, Merlin was just directing him, but he was the one actually carrying out the orders.
Somehow Merlin seems like, you know, this omnipresent shadow that he's everywhere in the world, to the point that he obscures everything that should be important, right? Which kind of ties in with her whole being able to pull the shadows, even though the biggest shadow here is Merlin. So I found this entire concept really mind-blowing and poetic.
Well, and that's kind of the idea is in a way, shadows was something I played a lot with, right? And this idea that he gives her this or he interprets this prophecy, and he's literally forgetting her. He doesn't realize that he's probably missing something very important, because he, like many men of his age, overlook women, especially once you've had a couple of babies and you're a widow. You know, you're not terribly important. You're not going to be. Are you going to go off to war? You're not magical, or you're not magical enough. I mean, I actually love Merlin. I have no beef against Merlin whatsoever. But I wanted a sort of. Usually Merlin is sort of painted in either sort of a crazy way or kind of, you know, endearingly mad and powerful. And I thought it would be better, and that's one of the reasons that I think the scene is so important, that when Nimue really sees him for what he is, which is an old man, the humanity of that kind of is very sad. And I think that I don't know how much you know of the whole story, but Arthur's stuff is not going to go well. Like the end of Arthur's story and Lance's story, and you kind of see at the end, I have sort of seeds of that happening. You know, things are not going to go well for them. And it takes Anna to see that, to really realize as well. I mean, who knows who's really pulling the strings of everything, you know? I mean, even she's able to get to the book and back to Vivian. You know, I wanted the Lady of the Lake. It's always this ethereal, wispy woman who lives in a lake and has a sword. And I was like, what if she's just a blacksmith and she's really magical and she's kind of a badass lesbian who lives out in the middle of a lake and actually has kind of made her life awesome. She's got a garden and she's got a beautiful view. She got to raise Lancelot for 15 years or so. She, loves him like a son. She stuck to her guns. She would not relent to keep herself, make herself acceptable to Merlin. and that's the important part about her. And so she sticks to her swords, I guess you would say. And Merlin is powerful.
Unintended.
Yeah, Merlin is powerful, and he does. I think his biggest fault is that he doesn't. He's such a big picture person that he loses really the understanding of how and when. I mean, Anna really starts to realize, because I think she becomes a better character when at first it's about her. It's very personal. It's, you ruined my life, you made everything terrible. And then she slowly realizes how all the women that come in and out of Carillon have had things fall apart because of Merlin's insistence on having Arthur and building up Camelot and making everything, you know, what it is. They have all been the unfortunate victims. And so she's like, well, he can't see me, essentially. What can I do? And it will take time. And it does take time. And that was intentional, that it's not overnight. She has to work really hard for a very long time while things are still happening. But she's in it for the long game. And so many of these stories are so cause and effect. You know, it's very much like, oh, this adventure and then this adventure and then this thing happens. But for her, it's building it up brick by brick over time, making sure that it's firm, because she is going to go all in at the risk of potentially everything.
Yeah, and I actually, now that I look at it, it makes sense that things happen the way they happen, because I don't think Nimue would be able to live with herself if she, say, stabbed Merlin in the heart, and then she wouldn't be able to live anyway. You know, Anna would have to probably live with that soul crushed throughout her life.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, in some ways, I think Nimue is kind of that. It in some ways takes from an older Jewish tradition, and my dad's side of the family is Jewish. The golem, this idea of this creature created from clay. If you've read The Golem and the Genie, it's one of my favorite books of all time. Beautiful book. And in a lot of ways, Nimue is almost an emotional golem. She is just this creature of, like you said earlier, of want and need and desire, but she has no history, she has no future. She is certainly this part of Anna, like this daughter she never had, that is also connected to her. So in that way, she is kind of disposable, which is sad, but it is this. That's how the story goes. They get locked in the tree together, and that's we don't really know what happens after, and that's kind of how I wanted to adapt that particular piece. So I did a lot of twisting things around, because that's how my brain works.
No, it was beautiful.
You said that Nimue was like the daughter she never had, but like I mean, isn't she also like the mask that Anna wore?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And there's that whole thing, right? Like I think it was an Oscar Wilde quote that give a man a mask and he will show you who he really is. So
yes.
How applicable is that in this situation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That the whole if you go, that's the first scene when Anna first sees Huifar for the first time, who's this sultry woman who barely wears any clothes, has sex with everybody, lives in this basically like Circusville in the middle of the castle, doesn't give a shit about anybody around her or what they think. She's actually jealous of her. She's very jealous of her, because because her sisters all got scooped up and her dad doesn't ever tell her no, and she's attracted to her and she doesn't really know what to do. She keeps staring at her, and she's this, red-haired goddess who's like 6 feet tall, and that's who Nimue ends up falling in love with, and truly falling in love with. And Huifar disappears, and that breaks Nimue. She's not deep enough to understand that life is back and forth. She gave her whole heart to her, and she's gone, and there's no resolve. And I think so many of us have probably, whether it's through death or just people being jerks, sometimes people leave. And if you don't have the emotional connection to beyond that, it's so baffling. And that was kind of, as she was breaking down, it was important that she had kind of her own little journey too. But yeah, she does all the things. I mean, Anna doesn't eat much food. She looks at food a lot, but she's probably got an eating disorder. She is very, she's very controlling about her clothing and fitting into her clothing and making sure it fits right. And meanwhile, Nimue is like, no shoes and complaining about her corsets and getting naked whenever she can. So yeah, I think there's definitely all the things that she would want to do, including, getting that close to, because Anna could never be that close to Merlin. There's no way. Nothing would have worked. So it had to be completely somebody else.
That was a really interesting twist that I thought that came in the book. And also that leads me to my next question, which is basically, how did you build your magical system in this world? Because, there are like prophecies and then some people can do magic. So how does that work out here?
Yeah, I wanted a lower magic, essentially, where it is. It's so the idea is that there are prophets and then there's prophet interpreters. So it's not always just very clear, because I think that prophecies can be, I don't love prophecy in story. I think that can be kind of a little bit cheesy. So I wanted it to be that it could be potentially open-ended. And one of the reasons that Vivian and Merlin conflict is because they have different understandings of certain prophecies, and she's always making life difficult for him. He wants to hear what he wants to hear. Sound familiar? I don't know if you know any people that are like that. And then the magic is more, I mean, in some ways kind of herbal magic, simple magic. It's not a lot of glitz and glamour and explosions and changing people with polyjuice potions, sort of a la Harry Potter. It's much more the simple practice discipline of magic, or making magical weapons, or, but even in the woods narrative, we hear about one kind of animal that's sort of a magical animal, but there's not a whole lot of it. I think part of it is that there's probably more, but Anna lives a very sheltered life and doesn't get out of the castle very often. And then, but also I think it's a world where humanity is kind of overtaking, and she's very conscious of that. I wrote a lot of that kind of, it's a little bit of an environmentalism message, but when she's coming back to Carillon for the first time in 20 years, she doesn't recognize it. The wild lands of her youth are gone. So she feels like a stranger in her own land. And I think a lot of the magic has been kind of lost as well. So I call it a lower magic, and it's mostly through books and rituals and spells, but there's a big cost to it. I wanted that to be really clear too. Like, Anna does all of this stuff, but it takes her a long time, and she loses a lot, and she has to go through a lot of suffering on top of everything else going on in her life to achieve her aims. So I don't like when magic doesn't cost anything. And actually, that's one of the points that is made in T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which is one of my favorite books of all time. But Merlin basically explains to Wart, he's like, which is young Arthur, you can't make a loaf of bread out of nowhere. It comes from somewhere. As a magician, you are summoning it from someone. So someone's going to lose that bread. You can't, basically this nod to sort of, energy cannot be made or destroyed. Matter cannot be made or destroyed. And magic has to hold that. But I kind of want it to be a little bit airy and ethereal too, because you don't want to make it too defined. I don't enjoy magic systems that are overly defined, because then I get stuck trying to figure out exactly what it is. So
I had one question about Anna, actually. So you know how she gives the crown to Arthur? Mm-hmm. I always kept wondering what would happen if she gave it to her children instead. Wouldn't she be in a more powerful position that way?
She could have been, but she really hated her ex-husband. Yeah. She really, 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 really hated him. And the biggest middle finger she could possibly give was to basically surrender the entire, kingdom that he was from. And I think that was her entire motivation, is that literally on his deathbed, he was like, make sure Gawain gets the crown. He will be king of Orkney. And she didn't. And he's kind of okay with it, because honestly, he would have made a terrible king. But, and he'd rather carouse and have not all the responsibilities. And that's kind of, I think, the way she looks at it too, is she's saving him from having to deal with all the stuff that Arthur is trying to unite everybody. And politically, it probably made more sense for her to do that as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Just the middle finger to Lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. Also, I noticed something about the story, and of course, you discussed it that you did take influence from different cultures. What I noticed was that there were a lot of similarities with Indian folk stories. For example, there is this story about this Hindu god Krishna. His uncle actually wanted to kill him at birth because there was a prophecy that Krishna would bring about his doom. And so he wanted to kill him, and so he imprisoned his mother. But then they actually exchanged Krishna with some other baby so that Krishna would be saved, you know. And then there's this entire thing of Durga, who's a goddess, and she's created by gods, given different weapons by different gods, so she can destroy evil. Just like Anna at different points was helped by different people. You know, for example, Vivian helped her learn the magic, and Arthur gave Nimue entrance into Merlin's castle, and so on and so forth. You know, so I did see a lot of resemblance, and
that's really cool.
Yeah, it was quite nice, especially the baby exchange thing.
Yes. That was something I wrote in, and I have no idea where that exactly came from, but I love that stories have a commonality to them. And in some of my other books, I look a lot more at sort of these ideas that there are key gods or creatures or beings that are so common throughout so many stories. I know I grew up Christian, non-practicing these days, but when I read the Bhagavad Gita for the first time, I could not believe how much from the Bible had taken from the Bhagavad Gita. I just was like, I can't believe this. Nobody told me this. And that's something I think that's so beautiful about story and story traditions, is that there are these common threads. And my area of study was actually the Middle East influence on the Arthurian legends. So there's all kinds of really interesting stories from Persia and the Crusades and everything that made their way to England, so far to even find that Paullomides is Arab in the stories. I mean, all the way back in the Middle Ages, there was they called him a Saracen, but he was, he was a Muslim knight that converted to Christianity. And I mean, the fact that they were talking about this so long ago goes to show how much our stories are intertwined. And I love that. I mean, I wish there was more diversity. Somebody asked me about casting, and I said I would love to see, if I ever got to see this in a movie, I would love to see blind casting, because it doesn't matter to me. Like it really wouldn't matter to me who anyone looked like. I kind of had Anna and Arthur look like sort of Viking quasi golden children, but it doesn't even have to be. There's no reason. It could be, very Bridgerton like, and the story is still the story. It's a story we're all familiar with. And I think, the Arthurian legend moved from country to country, and it got all the way to the Middle East. And there's even versions in Japan and China and, Australia and all over the world. People found something very compelling about this deeply sad story. It's not a happy story. Nobody ends up okay, I don't know. I think maybe Anna and Bedivere might end up okay in the very, very end, but we'll see what happens. I still hold out hope for the two of them, but
yeah.
I personally think that their relationship was very interesting because, as we know, Anna was married off when she was 12, and she's loved him since then. Like 12 is awfully young.
To be fair, I wondered if she liked him just because he was the only decent man around her.
Yeah. Well, and I think too that he's also stuck with Arthur, right? He's his best friend. And if you know the end of the stories, when Arthur is dying, he gives his sword to Bedivere and says, please throw this in the lake. And he comes back and he's like, did you do it? And he's like, no, I couldn't do it. And then he does it 3 times, very symbolic, right? And finally throws the sword in the lake. So we know that Bedivere stays with him till the very, very end. And that's why their relationship is so hard, because they're the in between the two of them is always going to be Arthur. But I think that in a way that makes them safe for each other, because he's never going to get rid of either of them. And he's not very smart. I mean, Arthur is very handsome and very well connected, but he's not very smart.
Yeah, he's the canonical jock.
Yeah, he totally is. He totally is. And he loves the boys' locker room too.
Subtle nod.
Oh, speaking of the boys' locker room, we should go to the girls' locker room, and we have Huifar there.
Yes.
So she just had a very sudden exit.
Mm-hmm.
And why was that? Was it Merlin who was afraid of her getting close to Nimue and maybe persuaded her to leave?
Potentially. I think my motivation for that was more that she was falling in love with Nimue, and Huifar is the kind of person that would have protected herself against that she sometimes love is a weakness, and she's built up this hedonistic life around herself. And what happens to this version of yourself and all these people and all of this thing, their own cult of personality? You lose your power when you submit to somebody. And whether or not she knew exactly what Nimue was, I don't know. But I think in my mind, she was getting too close, and she's one of those people that took the easy way. It's easy to just cut and run. She's one of the only women that didn't have to stay. She was there because her sisters were there. But also, I think after her sister Gwen dies, she's much, much closer to Gwen. And a few years pass, and I think it probably was time. So that was kind of my thought.
Yeah, she was a free bird.
Yeah, but I think even people who are free in some ways have their own constraint. So I wanted to show, yes, she seems like she has everything, but we also don't know. Her father could have summoned her home. We don't know what that other side of the story is. So
that's true. Another interesting thing that I saw in the book, that there's so much we are not going to know about, like this one point, and the other one was
don't go there yet. We are not going to ask for sequels right now. I'm going to beg for it at the end of the episode. Yeah.
No. We are going to talk about the very first thing you spoiled for me when we were reading this.
I love this picture of the two of you, by the way, like talking about it to each other. This makes my heart so happy.
I was so excited about it. I was so excited. And there was this one night where I was really excited about the book, telling her everything. And then I start telling her, hey, do you want to learn witchcraft? And she takes out these books and says, well, I have all these books.
I love it.
And I gave her a very Vivian sort of dialogue. I said, you can't learn witchcraft from books. And she flipped, because I have never said such a thing before. So
I was like, what's wrong with you right now? And then she said a lot of book-worthy lines. My most favorite one being, you have to deal with the storm that's going to come. You have to change its course and not send it back.
Yeah. Very true.
Yeah, so the thing you spoiled for me was basically this one thing, that when Anna comes to the court and she meets her son, and then she finds out that she's going to be a grandmother, and then we know nothing about it after that.
Oh, Elaine, the young, she breaks up the marriage, and he kicks her to the curb. So, that's
a grandchild.
Well, sorry. Which point is this when she comes?
Right. Elaine is Gwen's fiance. She was not his fiance, right. I believe, but I think she was his fiance.
The first, he wanted to marry her. Yeah. And I think there was an assumption that perhaps she was pregnant, that this was something, but whether she was or wasn't, it doesn't matter. There's no marriage. He agrees to basically live. I mean, she basically tells him, you can have whatever girl you want. Stop
long as she has a midwife.
Right. Yeah. Kind of thing. So, the idea is that she's not good enough for her son. So she plays the whole, weeping mother. How could you possibly do this to me? And we don't know what happens to that Elaine. She goes home with her dad or whatever. We don't know. But that's also a nod to, there's so many Elaines in the stories. They're literally like 5 of them. So in some ways they do kind of blend in together, and she she's just doing what she thinks she should be doing, and Gawain's an idiot 18 or 20-year-old who doesn't know any better. He gets better eventually. That's if I ever write more stories in this, he's one of my absolute favorite characters, and I was very mean to him. I definitely painted him as a spoiled, tempestuous jerk, but his brothers are much kinder, and I mean, their dad is kinder too, so
their real dad.
Yeah, exactly. Which is the other thing I thought was so funny, because back then you just never knew, right? Like, there were no paternity tests. You could,
of course. And, yeah. And speaking of the center of all this, I mean, the only actual paternity test was probably Merlin prophesizing whether the baby was yours or not.
Right. Which is how the whole like Mordred thing gets confused, because it's a different child that ends up potentially being the end of Arthur, and yeah.
And speaking of children, there's this one more line which made me like actually keep the book down for like 2 whole days, I believe. And then it was this part where Anna's just giving birth to her son and daughter. I don't know, I know they're fictional characters, but it hurts me to think about it.
I know.
But like, so she's giving birth, and then we have this flashback of her memory about her first time giving birth, and there's that one where the thing she says that I was myself just a child, not yet fully grown.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, that just made me feel things.
It's a scary thought. I mean, I have an almost 9-year-old who's going to be a young lady pretty soon, and I look at her and I'm just like. And I was a very early bloomer, and I remember reading, getting into medieval stuff and seeing how young women were married off. And of course they died in childbirth, because they were barely done growing as they were. They were not meant to have children. But I found it fascinating, though, that it meant these really compressed generations, right? So, Anna's only in her early 30s at the beginning of the book, and she's already been married. She's like 35. She's been married for 20 years, 22 years. And her husband died because he was 64 when they got married. She was 13 when she had her first child, and he was this old, disgusting man and cared nothing for her, had a mistress, because what are you going to do with a 14-year-old girl who can barely, has no real education and isn't, other than pretty, she just gave him a ton of money, and that's all he wanted. So her son is 20 and she's 34. And it's so hard in the modern day for us to think that way, but that really is how these generations were. So and that's why Arthur waits, so his child is 20 years younger than his nephew. So again, you have these really compressed generations, and it really changes how people's interactions are with each other and what the family dynamics are. And it gives, thankfully, Anna has a little bit of a chance to grow beyond that, which I also wanted to do too, because just because you've had your kids and you're a widow doesn't mean that you're not useful in some ways.
Ashvini, you and I knew each other from since we were 13, right?
Don't do this, Sanchi. Don't do this.
Fine, not going there.
Yeah.
But it's hard to imagine, right? I mean,
Most
it's a very,
yeah.
very different life, and a very different understanding of, what a woman's value was and how valuable her womb was, right? That was the really big part. And I think the only reason she was able to get away with it is because, she loved having a child, and that can happen sometimes. I had severe postpartum depression. I did not have a lovely, lovely experience with my first child, but it can happen. And for her story, she gave her something that was hers, to have Gawain as a little child who was a beautiful boy, gave her life and hope in a time that I don't think she could have survived, because she was so alone. But then she's able to, when she's older, because she's by the time she's actually with Bedivere, she's a bit older, so more age of consent, because they're only like 15 when the book starts. So, she was like 18 or so. But she knows that she's done the thing she had to do, which was that one heir, right? There's no doubt who that person is. So I think even though she's a little more reckless with Bedivere at that time, people really aren't looking because they're just excited that they're boys and they're big and strapping, and Bedivere's not around that often up there, so it's hard to go.
Things haven't really changed, right? Like when it comes to how women are seen.
Indeed,
especially in Eastern societies.
Mm-hmm.
Like India has the highest rate of child marriages in the entire world, and
currently maybe even child rape.
And that's I mean, that is literally what happens to Anna. I mean, that and it's horrible, and I writing about that kind of thing is very difficult, and I didn't want to spend too much time in that place, but it does change her forever, and it does. And so many women around the world have these experiences in so many different cultures. I mean, can't even in the United States, this is still a big problem. Not with the marriage part necessarily, but the child abuse and sexual abuse is still a very, very hard thing. But back then there was no recourse. It was just how it was. How lucky you are, princess. You get to marry a king. Is anyone going to feel sorry for you? No. And she doesn't ask for it, but she finds her revenge. She finds power through it. And I think that's certainly not a good thing, but it's not meant to be anything other than sadly historically accurate. Whenever you're writing things like this, it's a very difficult thing to write about, and I think a lot about it. But I think that's one of the reasons too that I actually wrote a couple more of the more intimate scenes in, because I wanted her to also find some kind of healing through it, because she had, even with her time with Bedivere, they were kind of kids. They were kind of figuring things out, and she kind of comes into her own from a sensuality perspective, and I think that's an important thing for her as a character. And I mean, I love saucy scenes. I think they're fantastic, but as in this particular story, I wanted to be sure they were doing more than just being sexy, because that's her, especially from a first person perspective. I'm always thinking, like, if she's actually writing this down. And I think part of it too is like she wants to be like, yeah, I did that night, and I did that night, and I did. It's like she's gonna have a little bit of her own, staking her claims. But it is very, very complicated, and we know, men often married 2 and 3 times because women, we knew so little about childbirth. We know so little about how to preserve a child. And it was not necessarily that people always say, the average age was 35. And it's like, it's not that people lived to 35 and died. It's that so many women and babies died so young, and other men as well died of very preventable diseases very young. But if you lived past your teenage years, you probably lived to your 60s or your 70s. It's just, we also know from the archaeological record, you were in bad shape by the time you died. Badly set bones and horrible arthritis and tooth abscesses and all this, all this stuff. So I like to think there are magic toothbrushes out there in the Arthur universe. Maybe that's not so bad, but yeah.
Yeah, they're probably sticks, which are, I guess, magical toothbrushes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this we have to discuss.
Okay.
Yeah, I knew I would forget you. Probably the most important line in the entire book. Where do I even begin?
You want me to begin?
Yeah, go ahead.
So he says, I knew I would forget you. So this again ties up with the whole Merlin being omnipresent, almost all-knowing. So does he actually know who Nimue really is? And if he knew who she really is, how did he let her go this far? Or was all of this prophesized? If all of this was prophesized, and if everything is prophesized, where does free will come in?
Yeah, it's a big question. I like this idea that Merlin is, in pieces, able to have the whole story, but never at once. It's kind of like the software is too much for the hardware to run. So he can't be everywhere at once all the time. He can have glimpses of it, and he can be, as he's getting older, the machine is getting even harder for him to focus on. And he's given so much of his life and so much of his effort and his time, and he probably put it down somewhere. I need to watch out for Anna. but he is a victim of his own prophecy and his own prophetic thing. So even if he knew, it's kind of like when you have that weird feeling of deja vu, that you've been somewhere or you forgot something, and no matter what you do, you can't remember it. But you might have a dream and you wake up from the dream, but then you still don't know what exactly that was. And that's kind of what I wanted. Because if you notice, especially in the first part of the book, he's always around Anna. He's always shadowing her. He's always popping up, and doesn't really have a reason to. But I wanted it to kind of be almost like he's like, there's something I meant to, something on the, why am I here? And as someone with ADHD, this happens to me all the time. I'm in the middle of the kitchen and I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing here. But that idea that he can't hold it all at once until it's too late. And he knows he's going to die, and he knows this is the end. And in a way, he still was able to do everything he set out to do. He just never saw his own fate coming. And I think in some ways, her prophecy is his death prophecy, if you look at it that way.
Wow. That is profound.
Profound. That's better than
her birth, his death, you know.
Ooh.
Which is, I mean, that's why it's important that the book opens up really with her imagining him kind of appearing out of nowhere, and then he fades into nothing at the end. So you try to keep, when you're an author, you try to keep these things balanced, you know. You hope it works and you hope people notice.
People notice. It was driving us crazy.
Yeah, it really.
And we don't want to answer all the questions, you know. Something. I mean, free will is a big question. I'm not ready to answer that one, but I like the answer more that prophecies are slippery, and even the prophets can miss and not realize.
So will we know more? Because are there going to be sequels? We are excited.
I would
Sanchi,
like there to
be.
be.
End of the episode.
Okay.
Not now.
Do we want to wait?
Go ahead.
I would like to. I have some ideas. There are a couple of other Arthurian stories that are lesser known, including one that has a trans character that's very, very old called Silence or Silence. And it's a character who lives their life as a man but is born as a woman. And it's really interesting and very complex, and is a knight in Arthur's court and all kinds of stuff. And I always thought that would be really interesting to fold into that story. I also would love Gareth's story. So Gareth is one of the knights that sides with Lancelot. He's also Anna's son. And I always thought he was a really interesting character, and made him a twin to Gaheris because they have such similar names. But they're different, and they're kind of the younger generation. So I think that as I was thinking of what I want to tell next, I would love to see that those people, the younger characters, have their own story, and see how that would play out as Camelot deteriorates, but also as the Holy Grail comes into, right, this idea of of that as well. And I love the stories of Percival. Unfortunately, the Nazis in Germany got really obsessed with the Percival myth, and it's really hard to get into without getting there. So he actually has a sister as well that I was thinking of actually using her in the stories too, because that might be a way around it. But yeah, the Nazis love Percival. It's so annoying. It's like one of those things, every time I would get into it, I'd be like, oh yeah, we don't really talk about this because Hitler loved Percival. But he's one of the folks that finds and then Galahad, because Galahad is the one that achieves the goal in the Grail in the story. So I kind of thought it would be fun to do sort of a multi-person point of view story where you're getting kind of all these different angles as Camelot is kind of falling apart, and kind of what happens after. So
personally, I would love to, of course I want a sequel, but I would also love to read a prequel, speaking of Igraine's story and Vivian's story. And in fact, what happens to Vivian, I would really love it if she somehow shatters this lake magic.
Yes.
And just comes and seizes the moment. It would be amazing.
Well, I have a feeling Arthur will be running to her very quickly, because that's his aunt, right? So if Merlin is gone, who's the next best person, right? And who gave him that beautiful sword, and the other sword? But yeah, yeah. So that's true too. And I also I thought about writing a novella, sort of a shorter story of Anna's time at the castle, because if you read the book, she poisons her husband, she kills him. And that's the only reason that Morgan has a hand over her, is because, like, I will tell everyone that you murdered your husband. And she's like, okay, I guess I'll do what you ask of me, because I don't want to be a murderess, that obviously. But I think it would be interesting to see her younger and how her romance kind of blossoms, but also what she's able to do to kind of figure out how to navigate a politics in essentially a foreign country. I mean, at that point, Scotland is very far away, even though it's not that far away. It's very far away from them and very rough. You know, it's just a very rough place. And she's been brought up in the lap of luxury. So
yeah, in fact, even Arthur would have an amazing backstory. I mean, when does he discover that he likes boys? You know, even Morgan, her adventures with Merlin would be fun to know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of potential for sure.
And my personal favorite would be just, Adventures of Wayfar. Like, needn't be in court, but just like wherever she goes, whatever she does.
Her and her merry band out in the woods doing all kinds of crazy things. Absolutely.
Yeah, we are all team Wayfar.
Wayfar. It's a hard name, yeah. It's a hard name.
So the first time Ashvni told me about this character and she sent me a passage to read, because we were very active readers for this book. So I read the passage and I'm like, she's hot.
Yes. Yep, very much so. Very much so. She's sort of the sultry, sort of feminine ideal, but also has kind of masculine qualities too. She kind of has that almost a non-binary kind of, she doesn't buy into either gender requirements. She's just kind of her own person, and she's very fun. Definitely one of my favorites as well. She also says whatever she wants, which is great, and drinks very heavily. She's kind of a pirate. She's, in some ways she kind of reminds me of that, that kind of character that's just sort of like, this is me.
yeah, indeed. And that brings us to our last section, which is my personal favorite, the stupid questions section. Okay, can I start, please?
This is my favorite segment of anything. Okay, your turn. Fine, go.
Okay, so my first question, would you rather stay in this age or that age?
That's a good question. It's hard. The older I get, the more disheartened I am with the modern world, but I'm such a research nerd, and the fact that I'm able to, like I said, I'm almost 40, so things have changed pretty significantly. I studied illuminated manuscripts pretty extensively in graduate school. The problem is, back then, early 2000s, to digitized versions of things did not exist. Now I can Google every great book in the history of humanity and find high-resolution pictures of it and go through picture by picture. So that part of me for sure. But at heart, I am a total hobbit, and I just love, I love the home and the hearth and hiking. I love being in the woods. So I think I would be fine. If there was magic involved, definitely would tip the scales toward old times, but it's a hard question to answer.
I love how your first thing about the modern world is that it has internet instead of it having, women empowerment and laws protecting us.
Yes, that too. But, for my own personal, it's all part of that because I have access to that. And I never would have had, I mean, the fact that I have an education and that I have an advanced degree is all part of that. I don't think I would have been burned. I mean, truly, I would be a witch for sure. So in this timeline, I want to stay here.
We would all be burnt at stake.
Yep.
We would all be burnt at stake. But you know what?
Yep.
The reason why I say this is a silly question for me personally is because it has to be this age, because modern plumbing. Why is that not the first thing that comes to people's minds?
There was more plumbing.
Be able to deal with.
There was more plumbing than people think, all the way back to the Roman period. And even before that, there's there was more Plum. Hot water, not so much. That's the one thing that I love, warm baths so much that I don't know that I could deal with. I don't know that I could deal with cold water. I've had to be with cold water before, and it's just, whew, spoiled.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sure, Indus Valley civilization, and they all had some form of public sanitation and drainage, but seriously,
Yes.
modern plumbing is just out of this world.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, modern plumbing. That's my reason for this. Okay, so my silly question, which Ashvini hijacked even before we started this, was: have you ever put a curtain around yourself and pretended to be a princess?
I did. I actually turned an entire curtain into clothing when I was about 8 years old. There's a picture of it somewhere, but I mentioned that I have a tiara. So this is my power tiara that I do wear. I bought it for myself about 6 months into quarantine because I just didn't have enough tiaras. So I keep it here on my desk next to my crystals and things. But I love costuming. I love dressing up. I'm a terrible sewer, terrible. So if I ever wear things, it's either cobbled together from secondhand stores or I have to buy it. But yeah, I love dressing up. I love makeup. I love Halloween. Oh, it's my favorite. So yes, the curtains. I did have a curtain dress.
Well, I mean,
Ashvini, is this a silly question?
Yes, definitely. It will always be a silly question. Questions are always about context, and in this context, it is definitely a silly question.
Yes.
But don't worry, I have sufficiently many of them too.
Great.
So we are equal. So my next silly question is, I recall that when Anna first came to Carolyn, there was this big tournament that was being organized for the Knights. And apparently the cooks were very busy with preparing a big feast for it. So this is really a silly question. I did not think this through. But did they not cook fresh food? I mean, why would they start preparing days before a tournament?
Yeah, they would actually, because a lot of the foods were cooked ahead of time, things in pies and things of that nature. So the sort of Western kingly diet was a lot of things that could be kind of shelf stable and then rewarmed up again, as well as all the herbs and spices, milling all the different flours and things. So there was a lot of work that would go into it, especially preparing for that many people, not to mention killing, dressing, and cutting up all the animals that you would have to eat. That takes quite a few days to get all of that done. So yeah, it probably would have, and a lot of dried foods, like dried fruits and meats and things of that nature. But I always, if you ever read about the food that Henry VIII had, was some of the most ridiculous stuff. Like they would make animals, like fake animals, out of other animals. So they would take like a swan's head and like lizard feet and like a bird, different birds for things. They'd sew them together in these like ridiculous edible sculptures. Very strange.
That is a different sort of violation altogether.
Yeah.
But I did notice that there was not a lot of meat. For example, they said that in Avalon they stayed away from meat because apparently it would take away your prophesizing powers. And even Anna ended up eating a lot of, she would have a lot of toast and wine and honey and butter, cheese, and lavender.
And fruit. Yep.
Yeah. It was a very almost raw diet, I should say.
Yeah, and I love that kind of food. That's probably I will take a cheese plate with fruits over just about anything in the whole world. Like that's like my favorite food. So that might have something to do with it. I think a lot of fantasy is a lot of roasted meat, and it's kind of boring. There's just so much food. Like I said earlier, I love tea and tinctures and different herbs and spices together and vegetables and things of that nature. And you definitely would have had that. In Castle, they would have had things like potatoes and cabbages and all this kind of stuff stored for a long time in the cold places because you could kind of do that in basements. It's kind of neat how that worked out. But yeah, there is not a lot. She's pretty much a vegetarian, I think, if you kind of look at what she eats, and she's kind of turned off by greasier animal foods. But yeah, good notice. I love describing food, and I think that's a really fun way into a story as well. So
That leads to my next silly question, which is
Okay.
also about food. So, do you like, are you very historical when it comes to describing food, or do you like just embellish to, make the reader feel like, oh, I want to eat this?
Well, when it's fantasy, I feel like I can do more of that, just kind of playing along within the constraints. What I'm writing now, which is Regency period, so like 1812, 1820, they were very specific about the food that they ate. The French, the English, so I have to look up all the stuff, and I want to make sure, no matter what I do, that at least it's close. Even though this is a Regency world with witches in this particular story, I want to make sure that it's, because to me, it feels like a touchstone to the people to know what kinds of things that they would eat. Sometimes it's disgusting. Like one of the meals I described was like pork and oysters, and I cannot think of a combination to me that seems like a grosser thing, but that was one of their favorite things in the whole world. And they loved, creamy sauces and really fancy things, and dessert tables, that would just go for days. So I love the art of food, and I love to cook myself. So I like to think about what characters like to eat, and what they find. And some people don't really find food that interesting either. So it's fun to write characters that don't. I do have my current main character loves food and is completely open with the fact that she loves food. And it's like one of her driving motivations. And I just love it. I love that she just is unapologetic. She's just like, I'm hungry. I'm going to go eat some food. And she makes a picnic for someone else in the story. And they're just like, how do you have this much food? And she's like, have you not met me? And it can be. Food is such a ritual and a joy, and the process and serving and everything is so interesting to me, and different cultures, and how food is eaten with your hands or not with your hands, or with bread or with not with bread, and what is considered okay to eat and what is not considered okay to eat. All of this stuff is just no end of interesting. So
all our silly questions have such legitimate answers.
Yeah, that's true. I think I'm going to go and have a second dinner after this. Yeah, that was sufficient motivation for me to read your book, your upcoming book.
When is it coming out?
I don't know. I will let you know. I have a book coming out later this year, which has a lot of food in it as well, and it's also a Regency book, but it's very, very different. It's the sequel to my first book, and then I do write a lot in history. So my other stories are sort of Edwardian, turn of the century monsters, lots of food, and blood drinking, because some of the monsters have to drink blood to survive. But yeah, food is almost always somewhere in my stories, because I think it's just fun. And then coming up with your own ideas. I actually did that series called These Marvelous Beasts, and I did a similar thing to this, like a little writing group that I spoke to about it, and they wanted recipes, and they actually made a drink for the book, which I thought was like the coolest thing ever, like a cocktail. Oh, wow. And I don't drink, but I thought it was absolutely wonderful and so appropriate.
Writing's just this thing where you can, just put everything you've ever wanted in this one place together.
Yep, you absolutely can.
And this reading, we were really into the book, and we read it like kind of together, and we tried not to give each other spoilers.
No, I didn't try any such thing. Sorry.
I love it.
And this entire thing has been such a great experience, and like all thanks to you, so like thank you.
Well, I'm so glad that we happened to bond over chintz fabric and the story of that, because I joke, because I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I said, I'm just going to start tweeting the stuff that I'm doing normally, just to see, because I started to realize people didn't know that chintz fabric came from India. I had no idea. No clue that all of this stuff happened. I mean, I only touched on the very, very surface of it, or that it's still being made today in the same way that it was made hundreds of years ago. And it's an art form into itself. And to me, that's just about the coolest thing that I can do. And hopefully, you hope that eventually, just by being yourself, people will find your writing. And that's kind of the best case scenario. So you're my best case scenario.
Oh, thank you.
And that, folks, was a great episode, and thank you so much, Natania, for giving us like your time and all your wise words. Like I was literally like scribbling notes, for a lot of things you said.
Yeah, definitely. I think I really enjoyed not only the episode, but in general, I don't think we put this much effort into episodes, and it was completely worth it.
Oh, well, thank you. I feel honored. I feel honored. So
it didn't even feel like work because, we got a book to read.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. It's like my favorite thing too. It's like, oh, we have books to read. Oh, so sad. No, this has been an absolute pleasure, and I'm so glad the book connected with you. And I love hearing how it can connect across cultures and experiences, because that's certainly what I hope for too. So just thank you.
And thank you, Natania, and hopefully we can maybe see you at some other point of time. Maybe with a new book to discuss.
Yes, I will let you know. I will keep you posted.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.